Hello, my fellow warriors. Welcome to the Warrior Insights channel, where today's topic of discussion is Palestine, Ohio, the next EPA sacrifice zone. How you can prepare yourself when a massive chemical burn spews tons of hydrochloric acid into the air. Before I get into that, if there's anything you'd like me to go over or news articles for me to review, please send them to warriorinsights1@gmail.com. As always, this video corresponds with my Substack that can be found at athenaangelique.substack.com. Let's get into it. On February 3rd, as you may have heard, a Norfolk Southern train comprised of roughly 150 cars derailed, and approximately 20 of those rail cars were listed as carrying hazardous materials. Those cars contained vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, ethyl hexyl acrylate, ethylene glycol monobutyl ether, and isobutylene, which are known to have been and continue to be released in the air, surface soils, and surface waters, which led to the EPA releasing a letter. This letter was released on February 10th, and this letter was directed to the Deputy General Counsel for the Norfolk Southern Railway Company, which is responsible for the derailment of these train cars. They observed the following waterways were affected by this incident: Sulphur Run, Leslie Run, Bull Creek, Norfolk Little Beaver Creek, and the Ohio River. Now, why is this important? Well, looking at the map, we can see that it affects roughly 25 states in the United States and a lot of major waterways. The letter also includes a page 2, which is extremely alarming if you examine paragraphs D and E. I know it's small on your screen here, but I will read it to you. 5 rail car tankers of vinyl chloride were intentionally breached. The vinyl chloride was diverted to an excavated trench and then burned off. Areas of contaminated soil and free liquids were observed and potentially covered and or filled during reconstruction of the rail line, including portions of the trench / burn pit that was used for the open burn of vinyl chloride. Let's go into that a little bit. These cars, 5 of these cars, were intentionally breached, diverted into an excavated trench, and then burned off. The open burn of vinyl chloride. Now, I wanted to delve into this a little bit further and say, is this a common practice for the EPA to do such an open burn? First, I would like to examine how much are we talking about? How much can 5 rail cars of vinyl chloride hold? As a general rule of thumb, a typical rail car can hold between 25 and 30,000 gallons. Now multiply that by 5, we have upwards of 150,000 gallons of vinyl chloride. Not to mention that that is mixed with other chemicals that were on board the other rail cars. I looked into this. The EPA typically does not use fire to dispose of vinyl chloride because it can release toxic byproducts such as hydrogen chloride and dioxins. The preferred method is through incineration or chemical treatment. It involves the controlled burning of vinyl chloride at high temperatures in a specially designed facility. So, what prevented the EPA from siphoning the trenches into larger tanker trucks capable of transporting such material to a specially designed facility? Well, this tweet may lend some insight into that. After the controlled burn, a hazmat crew member said, "The rail line basically ordered us to nuke the whole area so they could get the trains running again so the rail company wouldn't lose profits." Now, mind you, Norfolk Southern is owned by BlackRock. Now, BlackRock owns a lot of things, which, you can't really, which doesn't say too much, but let's just say Norfolk said, get this show on the road. We don't care I guess we'll pay for it later, or some kind of taxpayer funding will figure it out. Let's get this show on the road. How far will these toxic emissions from the burn-off travel? I have a map here that says, here's around a 200-mile radius report from the village. And let it be noted that the local authorities evacuated residents within only 1 mile of the controlled burn, and they were allowed to return home 3 days after. How quickly would you return home if you saw this outside your home as the controlled burn was going on? Now, I'll leave a link to the video in my Substack. You can play the video. It's pretty alarming, I would say. So I wanted to compare this to the response of a nuclear incident in a communist country. I compared it with Chernobyl, the April 26, 1986 disaster, as you may well know. In a communist country, the response to initial accident was 10 kilometers or a 6.2 mile radius, which was later included a 19-mile radius. But the city of Pripyat was not immediately evacuated. People conducted business as normal for up to 36 hours after the incident. They were celebrating weddings, they were outside, they were living life as normal, being exposed to alpha and beta particles, all floating in the air after this explosion. And as you may recall, in my last video about nuclear war survival kit, those particles will start reaching around 24 hours depending on your location and distance from the fallout zone. So by then, the delegation had soon ample evidence that the reactor was destroyed and extremely high levels of radiation had caused a number of cases of radiation exposure. They initially told the residents of Pripyat that they can return in 3 days. But then that evacuation became permanent. Everybody left all their belongings behind thinking that they would be able to return home, and then it was designated uninhabitable. So think about that. These residents were told to return home. Now, granted, it's not a radiation incident, but it's still very dangerous. Then I look into what's available to all emergency responders. It's available to civilians. It's called the Emergency Resource Guide. And I looked at vinyl chloride. And it says that this is extremely flammable and you should do everything in your ability to prevent it from catching fire. It will be easily ignited by heat, sparks, or flames. And then pay attention to the health paragraph here. Vapors may cause dizziness, asphyxiation without warning, and some may be toxic if inhaled at high concentrations. And I know during my training as a deputy sheriff in the police academy, they did show us a video of what can happen if you immediately rush to an overturned tanker carrying toxic substances if you don't pay attention to the placard on these vehicles or these rail cars. It showed a state trooper seeing a overturned tractor trailer that was leaking high amounts of anhydrous ammonia. He saw a victim on the ground, passed out, who was already dead, and he went to go save him with his medical kit. Well, within about 5 seconds, you see that state trooper succumb to the fumes himself. And this is why you have to pay attention to all placards of any vehicle that you may see turned over. So if even first responders don't pay attention, they could easily succumb to something like this. So just keep in mind that the EPA did a controlled burn on purpose. If you look at the guidelines of this, it says that the evacuation or the isolation is for 1,600 meters or 1 mile in all directions. But I wondered if that considered the size of the spill at 150,000 gallons or more. You have to think about that when considering all guidelines. And again, It says if there's a spill or a leak, you are to eliminate all ignition sources. Then we go into the side effects of vinyl chloride inhalation, which is similar to anhydrous ammonia with shortness of breath, cough, dizziness, headaches, respiratory depression, and CNS depression. CNS depression is your nervous system, which means you could die. Long-term symptoms include potential Raynaud phenomenon. How do you treat this? Well, you stop ongoing exposure. You go in fresh air away and you go to highly ventilated areas. If you're going to be in or near these treatment sites, you're going to need a level B or level A protective gear with a self-containing breathing apparatus. Again, if the medical and the emergency personnel handling this situation need protective gear just to handle the site, what do you think is going to be in the air when they burn it off? I looked into some of the other chemicals, such as the ethylhexyl acrylate. Basically, you just have some gastrointestinal irritation and ulceration, some severe skin irritations as well. It didn't seem to provide any long-term environmental effects, although it is acutely toxic to fish, invertebrate, algae, and long-term exposure to those animals. But it's unlikely to persist in the environment since it biodegrades rapidly in sewage treatment plants. But again, that was just one of the chemicals, and it wasn't the primary chemical that we are concerned about. But again, it is a contributor. None of the ERG protocols for any of the chemicals I listed earlier in the article called for a controlled burn on site. Given the orders from Norfolk Southern, did the EPA just say, you know what, we'll probably just make this a sacrifice zone or a Superfund site, and all right, fine, we'll just deal with the orders from Norfolk Southern and we'll get the show on the road, and hey, we don't live here or whatever, we'll figure it out later. Well, first of all, we need to know what are sacrifice zones. Around 250,000 Americans are living in parts of the United States where the rates of cancer by air pollution exceed the United States government's own level of acceptable risk. Residents of these communities die of cancer and other illnesses more often and earlier than people sometimes just a couple miles away. Many of the residents in the area don't even know this. Now, I will say I grew up on Long Island, and 1 in 9 people on Long Island had breast cancer. And you kind of wonder, was Long Island, the whole thing, designated a sacrifice zone? Well, according to the current website, no, but you have to wonder about the North Shore power plant that used to exist on there and how a lot of parts of Long Island were built on top of garbage disposal sites. How did the radiation affect the people of Long Island if the cancer rate is so high? You have to wonder, are all these sacrifice zones really still on the map, or are some of them undeclared? Was Palestine, Ohio declared a sacrifice site or a Superfund site, and the residents don't even know it yet? I found a map of the sacrifice zones. If you're interested in it, I listed them in my Substack. A lot of them are in the state of Texas, believe it or not. And although it appears that they're surrounding chemical plants, power plants, and refineries, if the EPA is willing to designate areas as sacrifices for various business endeavors, then nothing would stop the EPA from designating environmental tragedy areas as temporary sacrifice zones or Superfund areas. But now that we've established that the EPA is willing to risk your life, what about the cause of the derailment in the first place? Was that preventable? I included a really interesting video here, of which I paraphrased in my Substack in this paragraph. Basically, in 2012, a train derailment happened like this in New Jersey. And a lot of people put pressure on the regulators to come up with some kind of reform to prevent derailments like this from happening again. The reform reached the Obama administration, and basically it was an election year when this reform was finally brought up to be voted on. And it would have required high hazard flammable class 2 trains to have a special braking system called the Electronically Controlled Pneumatic Braking System, or ECP, which is electronically driven, as it says, on these rail cars that have these class 2 chemical carrying trains. And the way the rail industry pressured the Congress and the administration, the politicians, was saying, let's change the definition of what a class 2 train is. And then basically, when the Trump administration got into the White House, the Republican Party received $6 million in donations from the rail industry, and they never heard of the ECP again. Now, I will remind you or tell you that the trains currently are using Civil War era braking systems. Not many of these braking systems were ever implemented. And so that's why we are seeing what we're seeing today. I'm not saying that is the cause of this particular derailment, but I'm sure it was a factor. Also, February 13th, 2 other trains derailed. One in Texas and one in South Carolina. Interesting. Again, were the brakes part of the derailment? We'll have to wait for the investigation if the NTSB is in on this, or the police, or whoever's going to investigate it. I would have to say the NTSB investigates all transportation incidents. And regardless of their findings, will anything change? As I mentioned in prior substacks about the rail unions and the railway strikes, the rail unions have been crying out for not only better working conditions, but improved safety conditions at their job. They know what they're doing is dangerous, and they need more funding. They need more sleep. So could it have been also a mechanical error from an overtired rail worker who's worked 6 days in a row, 12 or 14-hour shifts, and he's just done? And because if you remember, in January, the Biden administration basically said that strikes were illegal, get back to work, and shut up. We gave you a raise, or we're going to give you a raise. You guys just have to work because it's essential to our economy. Now, does that fix anything? No. Forcing people to go back to work because they all of a sudden make strikes illegal, which I wouldn't say all of a sudden because that's been done before, but it doesn't fix the problem. Forcing people to go back to work doesn't fix the problem. It makes people disgruntled and bitter, and nothing improves. It is essentially slave labor, forced labor, whatever you want to call it. If the people are unhappy that work for you and you force them to work under horrible conditions, accidents are going to happen. It's just a natural thing. So we'll see where that ends up. But legislation is needed, or I hate to involve the government in things, obviously, but something has got to force these railway companies to make their operations safer. They cannot keep risking people's lives and the environment because they want to just get things going again. Now, I'm all for capitalism, don't get me wrong, but again, if we are seeing multiple derailments and nothing is happening to fix the situation, we need to address the root cause of the problem. Okay, but also, where are the climate activists now? Honestly, how come they're not picketing and showing up signs at the Norfolk Southern Railway Company side? How come they're not throwing soup on their executives' cars? How come they aren't protesting? Where are the environmentalists? Where are you? You're so willing to block roads and throw tomato soup on Van Gogh paintings. This is the time to protest. This is the time to call for action, environmentalists. So I'm asking you, if you really do care about the environment and what's going on right now, you need to be protesting or waving your signs or calling for action for the Norfolk Southern Railway Company. And you need to also be talking to the EPA to ask why this happened and why that they just allowed it to occur. The open burn. Why did they do the open burn? All right. Now I'm going to address what can you do to protect yourself from incidents like this. And yes, you can do things to your home and to your car which we're going to go over now. You can install home air filtration that is designed specifically to capture gases. Well, not specifically, but it's designed to capture gases such as HEPA filters, which are commonly used in air purifiers. I included a link to one in my Substack. Then, if you're going to be outside, a full face respirator with a NATO 40 filter. If you need to be outside to transition from point A to point B, to get out of there, to evacuate, you're going to need to protect your lungs. Then I included vehicle filtration. So if you need to drive 100, 200, 300 miles out of the area, you can filter the air in your vehicle with a premium cabin air filter with activated carbon. That will help at least prevent your air conditioner or your circulated air in your vehicle. Or make sure you use your air conditioner on recirculate to go through the cabin filter, and make sure that your cabin is properly ventilated. Then if you're going to stay home and stick it out, you're going to need some water filtration. You could see here a picture of somebody's water test 17 miles away from Palestine. And if you see on the screen, it's 900 parts per million, which is insane. I would not touch that. I would not drink it. I would definitely filter it with a zero water filter. You're going to want a water filtration system on standby at all times. I've tested and personally stocked up on the zero water filter, and they do an amazing job at filtering heavy metals, chemicals, sediments, and more from water. You can read their report on the zero water filters, which I've included a link in my Substack. Oh, what about, I could just boil my water, no big deal. Well, I've included a video in my Substack where somebody is actually boiling the water in Williamsburg, Ohio, and you see a bunch of plasticky looking bubbles on the side of the pot. Again, filter your water, make sure it reads zero. The net zero picture includes a water tester, and you could dip this into you take this and you dip it into the water, and it will show you how many parts per million your water contains. And I will tell you, this beats bottled waters, it beats refrigerator filter waters. The net zero, when you stick it in, it says zero every single time. You test bottled waters, it would not say zero. So these zero water filters really, really work, and I highly suggest you have it for any natural disaster. So these are just some of the things that you can do. Also, be prepared with your animals. Make sure your animals, a lot of farmers saw that their animals perished during incidents like this. If you can, gather them in a trailer or bring them inside. If you have a lot of livestock, I understand that may not be a viable solution. You might just want to have a trailer and make friends with farmers outside of your 100-mile radius that can help store your animals until the air is clear enough for them to eat and drink again. So you want to think about an emergency plan for your animals. Then, of course, you're going to want to rely on your pantry items that you've stocked up, because you may not want to eat fresh fish or fresh vegetables or anything from a contamination zone where hydrochloric acid has been raining down on all the crops. You don't know what kind of chemicals are on the food that's going to be in these areas for the next who knows how long. If you have a well-stocked pantry, you're not going to have to worry about that. So keep those things in mind. As you know, in the past 3 years or more, every single day we are seeing threats to our standard of living. And I want to ask yourself, what are you doing to strengthen yourself and build your fortress against these threats? You have to pay attention. Don't just wallow in the news. Don't just feel bad. Actually take some steps. And that's the purpose of why I'm making these videos and writing these Substacks, because I want to research the problem and find viable solutions so that you can stay informed and stay vigilant. And until next time, thank you for watching. Ever forward.